Good morning. R. Fisher here, fearologist, Canadian, and interested observer of what's happening in the world of culture of paranoia. Yeah, we also have a term culture of fear in the academic literature, but I'm just really noticing from the media, I don't know if you've been watching lately, culture of paranoia and or psychotic culture or near-psychotic culture, all terms that I'm playing with lately, and I just want to review today. About a month ago, I did a first video on psychotic one. I'll put a link to that episode of me talking about how I think basically the word psychotic is actually very appropriate to describing where our world has gone in terms of how much fear, toxic fear, excessive fear, abnormal and irrational fear, pathological fear, is controlling and continuing and is going to continue to control massive amounts of people. Now, at one level, you say, oh, okay, well, okay, masses of people, maybe they're not as educated as they could be. They haven't had great fear management education. They're not prepared, and they're for the type of future in the scary world, so-called, that we are going into in this Anthropocene era. Well, I'm not just talking about people in mass and the sort of more or less not so educated people who are easily manipulated by fear. Point being, recently in Canada, this news story that has gone on for, I think, at least almost 2 weeks has been these two young men, barely in their 20s, no criminal record prior, have been turned into a massive bestial evil force sweeping across Canada. You can see I'm paraphrasing a kind of exaggerated hyperbolic reaction of media. So we're now got media organizations participating in this hype about this manhunt of these two teenage boys who are alleged to have, not proven to have, murdered a couple of people in BC, British Columbia, and on the highways, and then another professor was murdered as well on a vehicle was stolen. It seems these two fellows, young men, took off in that vehicle and so on, and now the manhunt just ended last night with their bodies apparently being found by the R.C.M.P. So what I'm now talking about is not just the masses in a paranoid, hyperbolic reaction, irrationality for the most part, to what is a crime, horrible crime, sorry for all the victims of that crime, but what had turned into the grand story narrative of the summer, the boring summer, that media and the R.C.M.P, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police of Canada, this is our major, important, police force that is a couple hundred years old, that's supposed to be so elite and so amazing. And they totally got into this creation of a story that they participated in. They didn't stop the story. Serial killers, manhunt across Canada in the wilderness, and news coverage supporting this, and R.C.M.P out in droves of SWAT teams and military vehicle type things, and massive amounts of energy, money that went into this great story that ends 2 weeks later. How many millions of dollars in time, expertise, personnel that the R.C.M.P, the Canadian police force, spent, never mind all the local police forces across those Western provinces where I live, spent on two boys, young men, no criminal record, I repeat. So point being is that the psychotic that I'm talking about, if I was to quickly define it, and I will define it in much more complexity in other videos in the series of the psychotic, or near-psychotic pathology, really, that I am claiming is now a term that is quite applicable from a cultural therapist point of view, from a fearologist point of view. Both of those I identify with. Creating a psychology of the most irrational, everyday, reactionary kind of mania that we're now seeing occurs. So I'm not making fun of these people. Let's be very clear, whether it's the populace, whether it's the journalists and the media, whether that's the R.C.M.P. My purpose is not to make fun of people for being fearful and hyperbolic and irrational and near psychotic. I'm serious, really near psychotic to watch. One of the stories on the media during this event of these two young men, so-called serial killers, is that, you know, there was this town where there was some evidence that perhaps they had, you know, found refuge and so on. There was a burning car that was perhaps theirs, the one they stole. And so the story goes. And anyways, there was this interview within people in these towns, a couple of them, several interviews. The media likes to interview. How are you doing? You know, how are the residents handling this case, right? Mixed media coverage. And it's all very psychological and emotional and trying to get into people's personal stories. Meanwhile, again, remember, millions and millions and millions of dollars are being spent on this case. High profile case, national. They interviewed several people in the community, including an indigenous community. A lot of those northern communities are very high percent of indigenous peoples. Anyway, it was just amazing who they interviewed. Now, of course, they're picking, the media picks who they want to interview and who they don't. But I'm just going to show you what I saw is unbelievable terror, paranoia in people who live in these communities and live there all their life. Like, this is their community. And a couple teenage boys are thought to maybe be in the area. And these people are actually saying, and these indigenous people, well, people won't go out of their house. We're all terrified. And then last night, after they caught, right, supposedly ended this manhunt because they found these bodies. So the top leader of the Manitoba R.C.M.P, you know, pretty uniform and all looking good. It was a woman, could have been a man, looking all sharp and very official, standing in front of a mic, this great big speech that's going to go on to tell the Canadian people in Manitoba, that, you know, this case is, quote, sort of over, ended. And literally this leader, woman, happens to be with, to me, looking very rational. And really, it is so irrational. That's my point of the psychotic. It's like it cannot even recognize its own pathology, its own psychoticness. It says, well, now that we have found, right, these bodies, I'm paraphrasing slightly, the Canadian people, actually said the Canadian people, I'm sure she did, the Canadian people can now breathe. Oh my God. This is national. This is the top leader of our R.C.M.P, our police force. It's unbelievably so twisted, so out of sync with reality. And that's what psychotic means. It's the process of becoming out of sync, dissociated, psychologically, psychiatrically, from reality. The American people, the Canadian people can now breathe. Two young boys that are not even known to have a criminal record, and they can paralyze a nation so we can't breathe. Do you see the story? This is my point, really. It's not what are facts, it's what the story that's being created by officials of the top ranked, highly paid. Don't even want to imagine what the salaries are of these top people. And it's massive, it's collective. This happened in Canada, right? So now quickly we could turn to another example of psychotic, but if we just went into the United States with these two serial murders, and I say serial only that they occurred, within a week or so, two massive mass murders. Types of terrorism, right? This is what we're talking about. How does terrorism work? And how does it create a psychotic patterning within so-called rational societies, modern, contemporary, postmodern, whatever you want to call our society today, that we're supposed to be so sophisticated and so together, psychologically, psychiatrically, at the cultural level. And I'm not just, again, talking about the mass people who are so-called ignorant and don't know better and need protection from the authorities of the state. The state is absolutely itself near-psychotic and is looking like they're not, looking like they're in control of the manhunt. Or now with these, as I say, let's return to America. There's now stories coming out after these two events, these horrible events, Dayton, Ohio, and El Paso, Texas. Stories now on the media. I just watched briefly on the National last night, CBC, and story after story of some mall or some event with large numbers of people right out in the summer having a good time, and a car backfires, pop, pop, and people are going into massive panic and running over each other and getting injured and just running. They're running in the streets. There was a couple of stories on the news last night of that happening when there was absolutely nothing went on. I think one case there was a couple of people that pulled out a handgun and shot at each other. And people are running, right? It's like, and the media is covering it. And of course, people are watching this. And this is what's called the post-traumatic effect, the cycle of fear that is so breeding on itself in an irrational way. And what it shows me, what my work is about, is that even our police forces, our security forces, you could take that right to the military level, etc., are really not in good shape in terms of this kind of irrational, hyperbolic, post-traumatic image making, emotionalism that's just gone so wild and so unhealed because people are not dealing with fear in a really good, healthy way. Fear management education is not being taught in the schools in any kind of systematic way. That's my expertise as a curriculum theorist and as a fearologist. That's my complaint, that we really need to do major work on how we are getting so psychotic. Paranoid is the other word, if you want. But this is dangerous stuff, right? It's like, I'm not trying to hear today scare more people to listen to me and my expertise because I can scare you that you should. That's what the media does. That's what police do in these incidences. They play it up so that they become the great controllers, the great secure force. And again, You don't have to be male to be in those dominant, secure forces. Females in female bodies are now speaking these same kind of words and carrying the same pathology, as far as I'm concerned, of a culture that is paranoid for the most part and becoming more psychotic. So what do you do about this as well? Number one is you just don't depend on these people, whether it's the journalist, news community, and don't watch a lot of it. Watch very little if you do, and watch independent stations if you can. I watch it very little because it's just so unhealthy mentally, culturally, politically, historically. This time will be seen as a race, as a society moving toward more and more disruptive, chaotic behaviors that we're constantly breeding in this paranoid cycle, the psychotic cycle. And at the same time, bringing in more reinforcements, spending more unbelievable amounts of money and putting resources into securing that paranoia. Right? So it actually creates the paranoia, and then it puts all this money economically, forces, specialties, specialists, and so on into controlling and creating the sense of that there's order going on. But the whole thing, if you actually look at it, it's so out of proportion. You could go on this, any statistical analysis of the number of, shootings and killings going on, let's just say in Toronto, for example, or Vancouver or some any big city in Canada, daily, like 10 plus. I'm not a statistics person, but I know enough to know that it is way more than these two young men going on every day. And you don't think that any of those most of them are gang related, drug related. Yes, they are. They're about money. They're about power. They're about street gangs. They're about people operating in these, different cultures, subcultures. They're very dangerous, and they're gun based, and they're you don't pay, we'll kill you, and we'll kill your friends, and we'll kill your family. We'll do whatever we need to do to basically make sure that you toe the line. That's the rule of the jungle in that cultural meme of drug culture and subcultures of all kinds of so-called illegal behaviors underneath the mainstream. Yeah, it's like, and you don't think that those people who are constantly shooting people and killing people on the everyday streets of Canada, you don't think some of those are serial killers? Well, almost all of them are. That's how they survive. They survive by serially killing people who don't pay their debts or do wrong to somebody or steal somebody's girlfriend in gang behaviors, just as one example. Nobody ever will call those people, and mainly because they can't find them, and the law enforcement don't put near the amount of effort into actually trying to find and pick out those people, because nobody calls them serial killers. Nobody says there's a manhunt on for the last person who shot somebody on the streets in Toronto in a gang-related violence. Yeah, it's actually become so normal talk. Oh yeah, this shows the evidence, as one police said on the news last night. This is evidence of gang-related, violence. You see, the stories are just being skewed to whatever the police or the news media actually want to construct at a particular time. And boy, did they construct a good one on these two teenagers, who everybody that knows them says they're nice kids. Okay, they were a little weird, they like guns or whatever, but they were nice kids. That's what everybody's saying. So these are not gang members. These are not systematic killers. And they petrified, supposedly, all of Canada, right? So when they were finally found, Canadians can now breathe. Oh my God. That is a spread of like fear, terror. This is like the optimum victory of the notion of terrorism, or what I sometimes call fearism, toxic form, the more subtle form underneath terrorism. Made my point. A sad point to speak about where we're at culturally, psychologically, say, and as I say, this psychotic, near-psychotic needs to be studied, and I will continue to do more nuanced videos, and I look forward to conversations on that. So just to end this video, I'm criticizing particularly in some sense the police force, the R.C.M.P. specifically, and from all levels, of who participated in this kind of paranoic, psychotic experiencing and spent just a hell of an amount of money and resources, which could have been put to way better, more important, preventative education, rehabilitation of people who commit violence, people who, obsessed by guns, and also just put into educating the society and our children, hiring people who can actually seriously help us to deal with fear in a whole healthier way than is being done right now. But you see, they don't put resources into that. They're going to put all those resources into hunting, these couple of teenagers. Unbelievable waste. So my critique of the police in this particular video is related to my working with B. Maria Kumar, and we just wrote this book together. He's the main author, started this book, and he asked me to join in with Desh Suba, who's a philosophy of fearism person from Hong Kong and Nepal. And all of us are talking about fear and prejudice in India. It's kind of a historical overview, a political overview, a spiritual indictment, really, to India's sad state of affairs in many ways. I'm not saying they haven't had great victories in that country, but we do quite a critical analysis of how that country really has to deal with fear in its developmental and its development policies, if it's ever going to overcome the major problems it has. So I point out B. Maria Kumar because he has a 30-year career as a police officer in India and was, the head of chief of police of Bhopal, India for, many years, decades, and awarded medals and so on. He's an incredible individual. And I so appreciate that he has come to understand the importance of fear and fear management as the core of policing, and fearlessness. He even has written and does write in this book and in other articles I've written with him, is such an important concept. Fearlessness is such an important concept to counteract this massive growing psychotic fear-based state, and people are going to be panicking now. Who knows where all around the world, thinking that every time they hear a loud song pop, oh, there's a gun, and people are running and scrambling and hiding, and unbelievable control that the terrorism, fearism is now perpetrating everywhere. And there's no sign that's going to turn around and get less unless those resources, instead of going into silly, put some resources in, sure, to the quote manhunt, quote misnomer, and then put the rest of the resources into something really useful and continue to do that. Not just the big story, the big event, the big burst of attention. So we can all feel good, we're safe, and our police is so great, or the military is so fantastic what they did and controlled the terrorists. Anyway, on and on. It's pathetic what's happened, and I'm now saying I'm trying to do my part, and I hope all of you, in many ways, one or another, will start to realize that we can't continue with a psychology based on fear itself. And that's why I'm calling for a fearlessness psychology. I just wrote this paper recently, put it up online, so that's available if you want to look it up. The title, you can download that free. All right, continuing the story, what fearlessness psychology would be something very radically different and much more uh, healthy, less psychotic, less paranoic. Psychology itself has, to me, is unable to actually turn this around, and the psychology that is being perpetrated by our best institutes is actually perpetrating and supporting. If it's not challenging and if it's not breeding fearlessness, it's breeding fear, is pretty much my simple basic argument. And I understand that argument is what I just said is insufficient to make a good case for my work. But I've also, as you know or may not know, I spent 30 years on studying fear and fearlessness, and I have hundreds of publications out there and videos, many videos. So um, I'm taking fear and fearlessness seriously, and with nuanced and with theoretical, philosophical, and with practical ideas as well. So that's not what this video is about, but I wanted to point out and stay aware in a sense of a healthy awareness of course, danger. There's danger, there is risks to everything. But really be very cautious to adopt the story. The stories being constructed for purposes that are not healthy. They are purposes that are operating, I think, for the most part, arguably, and I'm not the only one that has said this, other researchers have said this, a lot of those story narratives are post-traumatic. It's people not healing from the past hurts and the past fear-based experiences, terrorizing experiences. And because we're not a healing society, we perpetuate the coping with these horrible incidents, real violence. And we become the worst reproducers, consumers of the reproduction of the violence, the fearism, the terrorism. So that's my point. We participate in that construction, that production of fear, the unhealthy, toxic, debilitating, to the point of living in near panic at just the sound of some loud noise, which we'll see more and more incidents of this. Okay, so the school system is going to be kicking up in September, which is just a couple weeks down the road. I'm looking forward to educators of all kinds, especially, and leaders of education, to be thinking seriously about this. So pass this video on to any educators you know, and people in power and leadership. And I'm willing to talk to anybody to make this and turn this kind of cycle, very pathological, terror-based, fearism-based cycle around. Okay, thanks very much for listening.